In 1875 to 1943, it is considered to be one of the saddest race-related times in American history. I will be telling the story of this racial and sorrowful period of time. In the mid-19th century, Chinese immigrants came to America and sought wealth for their poor families. Americans were fearful from unemployment of the Chinese rise to power and began to riot against the Chinese. With a vote 201 to 37 and 51 abstentions, Chester A. Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese were expelled from the country for over 60 years. The Americans had no concern about how the Chinese were in debt and never paid any tribute to help. Chinamen are not ignorant heathens, and were not so thousands and thousands of years ago. They invented some of the most useful sciences of civilization. For example, the art of printing with movable types. Also, engraving was first invented by the Chinese. They were also the first to invent the mariner's compass, the first cannon, the first suspension bridge, and the first marble structure, as also the first civil force and the first school. All these were originated among those heathens. In 1849, the California gold rush had just begun in America. Chinese immigrants saw this as an opportunity to have that dream of prosperity and strong families. In 1863, the Transcontinental Railroad began construction. The Chinese saw this as another opportunity to achieve their dream of prosperity. With these dreams of wealth, all they got was despondency. The anti-Chinese had begun riots to Congress of how the Chinese were taking all their gold and property. Congress heard these riots and pondered if the Chinese would stay or pass a bill to have them excluded from America. In 1880, America sent a commission by the name of James Angel to China to negotiate how immigration would proceed in America. He said they will restrict and limit the immigrants, but not prohibit their entry. This was laying groundwork for the coming of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The Chinese must go, but who keeps them? A paper son was a Chinese person of race to immigrate to the United States illegally. People would get fake papers that said they had a relative that was a U.S. citizen. The reasoning for this was because of the constant wars in China. This put people in poverty, and the Chinese wanted money to pay bills. After the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese started making these papers. They were also created after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 occurred. This is an example of what people would do to get money, even if it was the payment of life in prison or death. And nothing less than the legalization of racial discrimination. The passing of the act was a tough decision for Congress to make. Multiple people who lived in the western United States felt that the Chinese laborers were affecting the economy. Americans who had this racial intention began making posters and posting them around California towns. As the arrival of the laborers coincided with the recession in the United States economy, President Chester A. Arthur had to choose what he thought was good for his people. His people, who only looked at color instead of skill, that had no problem making racial slurs to others of not their own. After much debate and time, he passed the act. The debate concerning the Chinese was not all political. On the streets of most California towns, the Chinese could not walk through without being insulted. The fear the Americans had of the coolies stealing their income was so real that many Americans went on riots, burning the houses of Chinese and driving them out until no one remained. Americans didn't see the Chinese as people, but like fleas, thinking that they could swat them away and be better than a race that only built their economy. It was nearly impossible to find a diplomatic solution that would please both Asian Americans and Americans. On April 4th, 1882, Chester A. Arthur wanted to veto the Chinese Exclusion Act. He had regretted his decision on passing the act. He was the only American to realize that the Chinese actually helped grow their economy. He saw that the work Americans were doing couldn't compare to the work the Chinese were doing. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In 1892, the Geary Act was passed, which extended the act for 10 more years. The Geary Act is considered to be a stronger version of the Angel Treaty. The Angel Treaty was to limit the Chinese but not prohibit their entry. This was passed because the Angel Treaty was gotten rid of due to the fact the Chinese Exclusion Act was going to be passed in 1882. In 1943, every act that excluded the Chinese was repealed. The acts were so repealed so China could fight in World War II alongside America. Once the Chinese came back, Chinese immigrants had been getting racial slurs and threats, but they are not as prevalent as before. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. A very historic case was the United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This case was the decision if a man born in America but had Chinese descent was a citizen of America or not. On March 28, 1898, Wong won the case, making him a U.S. citizen. This case became the foundation for the diplomatic resolution similar to this case. Whereas in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of the Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof. Is it then a crime to be a Chinaman? Shall I be dragged from my bed at midnight because I shall refuse to be photographed? No, I will not be photographed against my will like a criminal. I would be hanged first. On June 18, 2012, the House of Representatives apologized for the act. An 80-year ban which had innocent immigrants oppressed, that tarnished China's image poorly.
We have come together across party lines to show that no matter what side of the aisle we sit on, Congress can make amends for the past, no matter how long ago those violations occurred. It is because we have worked together in a bipartisan way that we will make history today. Today, for the first time in 130 years, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that expresses regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history. Over a century ago, the Chinese came here in search of a better life. During the California Gold Rush, the Chinese came to the United States to make something of themselves. Their blood, sweat, and tears built the first transcontinental railroad, connecting the people of our nation. They opened our mines, constructed the levees, and became the backbone of farm production. Their efforts helped build America.
This is a chapter of the story of life that we can't end. No one in the world can be treated equally. People who have more will fear those who have less.